In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a storm brews over Chipping Manor as Lady Beatrice Hargrove hosts an elegant gathering. But when her priceless sapphire necklace vanishes and a sharp-eyed solicitor, Mr. Percival Wren, is poisoned at the dinner table, suspicion falls on the late-arriving Edward Hargrove, whose debts and secrets unravel a deadly web. With 3 mysterious sapphire beads, a coded notebook, and a missing letter as clues, only Miss Jane Marple's keen mind can untangle the truth behind a theft-turned-murder. In a house of hidden motives, where trust is a dangerous gamble, will the quiet spinster uncover the killer before another secret strikes? Chapter 1. The Invitation. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a fold of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft glow of a July afternoon in 1925. The air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass, and the church clock, a steadfast sentinel, chimed 4 with a resonance that carried across the meadows. Rosehaven Cottage, home to Miss Jane Marple, stood at the edge of the village, its garden a riot of roses and lavender, tended with the quiet devotion of its occupant. Miss Marple, an elderly spinster with a face as delicate as the porcelain, teacups on her table, sat by her open window, her knitting a soft rhythm in her hands. Her blue eyes, sharp despite the years, missed little of the village's comings and goings, and today they were fixed on a cream envelope, its elegant crest catching the light. The envelope, delivered that morning by the postman, Mr. Gibbs, bore the seal of Chipping Manor, the grand estate perched on a rise overlooking St. Mary Mead. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, the manor's formidable mistress, was known for her rare but meticulously planned gatherings, and an invitation from her was a matter of no small consequence in the village. Miss Marple, though not one for social pomp, had received such an invitation, and its contents a request to join a dinner party at the manor that evening had set her mind to work. An invitation, she murmured, her needles clicking softly, is never just an invitation. It's a prelude to something else. St. Mary Mead was a place where secrets, like the roses in Miss Marple's garden, bloomed quietly but persistently. The village's inhabitants, from the bustling Miss Hartnell at the post office to the gossipy Mrs. Price at the tea room, were a tapestry of habits and histories, each thread known to Miss Marple's discerning eye. She had lived here long enough to understand that beneath the surface of tea parties and church fetes lay currents of ambition, envy, and unspoken truths. The invitation from Chipping Manor, with its promise of a gathering of notable guests, suggested a stage being set, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing what others missed, was already alert to the possibilities. The village was abuzz with talk of the dinner, for Lady Beatrice's invitations were selective, her guest list a subject of fervent speculation. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, wife of Colonel Arthur Bantry, had been seen at the tea-room that morning, her round face flushed with excitement as she recounted her own invitation. "Beatrice is planning something splendid," she had declared to a rapt audience, her curlers bobbing beneath her hat. "She's invited that actress, Sylvia Daly No, the one from the London stage, and Mr. Percival Wren, a solicitor from town, and her nephew, Edward Hargrove, is coming from London, though heaven knows when he'll arrive. He's always late, that one." Mrs. Price, pouring tea, had nodded sagely, adding that Edward's reputation for gambling and fast living was no secret in the village. Miss Marple, hearing of this through her maid, Lily, who had returned from the village, with a basket of gossip as full as her shopping, considered the names. Colonel Bantry, a retired military man with a penchant for long anecdotes, was a familiar figure in St. Mary Mead, his wife a font of village news. The vicar, Mr. Leonard Clement, and his young wife, Griselda, were also likely to be invited. Their presence a nod to local propriety. Sylvia Dale, the actress, was a newer addition. Her arrival in the village a few weeks prior having caused a stir with her auburn curls and theatrical charm. Mr. Wren, the solicitor, was less known, his visits to the manor shrouded in whispers of legal matters, and Edward Hargrove, Lady Beatrice's nephew, was a figure of intrigue, his absences from St. Mary Mead as notable as his rare returns. Lily, bustling about the cottage, recounted the village's chatter with relish. "They're saying at the post office that Lady Beatrice is showing off her sapphire necklace tonight," she said, her eyes wide. "It's worth a fortune, miss, all blue stones and silver, from Sir Henry himself. Miss Hartnell thinks it's wise she's invited such a mix once, to make a splash." Miss Marple nodded, her needles steady. "A necklace," she said softly, "is often more than a jewel. It's a symbol, and symbols attract attention." She recalled a case from her youth, when a stolen brooch had revealed a family's hidden resentments, and wondered what the sapphire necklace might signify at Chipping Manor. The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple, deciding to stretch her legs, donned her straw hat and set out for the village. The lanes of St. Mary Mead were alive with activity, the storm clouds gathering on the horizon lending a sense of urgency to the day. At the post office, Miss Hartnell, her pince-nez glinting, was sorting letters with a vigour that suggested she was sorting secrets as well. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp. "I suppose you're off to the manor tonight. Quite a to-do with that actress and young Hargrove. I don't trust him, you know, always sneaking about as a boy." Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. "People do change, Miss Hartnell," she replied, "though habits have a way of lingering." Her words were gentle, but her eyes noted the postmistress's eagerness, a sign of the villagers' hunger for scandal. At the tea room, Mrs. Price was serving scones to a crowd of villagers, their voices a hum of speculation. Mr. Pye, the florist, was arranging roses for the manor's centerpiece, his delicate hands belying his sharp tongue. "That's Sylvia Dale," he whispered to Mrs. Price. "She's got a past, mark my words. I saw her buying ribbons last week, and she looked positively furtive." Mrs. Bantry, at a nearby table, overheard and leaned in, her eyes bright. "Oh, Mr. Pye, do tell. And what about Edward? I heard he's been gambling in London debts up to his ears." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened quietly, her mind cataloguing each rumour, knowing that gossip, like a river, carried both silt and gold. The church, its stone walls cool against the summer heat, was her next stop, where Mr. Clement was preparing for the evening service. His round face, usually serene, was clouded with concern. "I'm invited to the manor tonight," he confided, polishing a candlestick, "but I can't help feeling uneasy. Lady Beatrice has been distant lately, and Edward's return has set tongues wagging." Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, replied unease. "Mr. Clement is often a sign of things unseen, but a dinner party, like a sermon, has a way of revealing truths." Her words were kind, but her mind was alert, noting the vicar's worry and wondering what lay behind it. As the afternoon faded into evening, the village prepared for the night's event, the storm clouds now a looming presence. Miss Marple returned to Rosehaven, her thoughts on the invitation and its implications. She dressed simply, in a black dress with a lace collar, her straw hat replaced by a modest shawl. The walk to Chipping Manor was a short one, the path winding through meadows, where sheep grazed, their bleats mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. The manor itself was a vision of grandeur, its stone facade glowing in the fading light, its windows like eyes watching the approaching guests. Grayson, the butler, greeted Miss Marple at the door, his face a mask of professional calm. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "Lady Beatrice is expecting you in the drawing room." The hall, with its polished oak and ancestral portraits, was a testament to the Hargrove legacy, its air heavy with history. Miss Marple, stepping inside, noted the faint scent of beeswax and roses, and the way Grayson's eyes lingered on the staircase, as if expecting someone or something to descend. The drawing room was a study in elegance, its walls adorned with tapestries, its furniture gleaming with polish. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a gown of deep violet, stood by the fireplace, her silver hair catching the light. Her sapphire necklace, a cascade of blue stones set in silver, gleamed at her throat, a focal point that drew every eye. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice warm but tinged with strain. "I do hope you'll enjoy the evening." Miss Marple, her smile gentle, replied, "An evening at Chipping Manor is always memorable, Lady Beatrice. I'm sure it will be illuminating." Her words were polite, but her eyes noted the hostess's tension, a sign of something unspoken. Colonel Bantry and his wife were already present, the colonel's moustache bristling as he recounted a tale of military valor to Mr. Clement, who listened with polite patience. Mrs. Bantry, her hat slightly askew, was deep in conversation with Griselda, whose youthful exuberance contrasted with the room's formality. Sylvia Dale, the actress, entered with a flourish, her auburn curls shimmering in a gown of sapphire blue that seemed to echo Lady Beatrice's necklace. "What a charming gathering," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the cadence of the stage. Her smile was dazzling, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the necklace, a flicker of something curiosity, perhaps, or envy. But Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor, arrived next, his thin frame almost lost in the grandeur of the room. His sharp, bird-like eyes took in the scene with a quiet intensity, and his greeting was formal, his words clipped. "Lady Beatrice, a pleasure," he said, his smile thin. Miss Marple, observing from her chair, thought of a hawk, watchful and precise, and wondered what business had brought him from London. "Solicitors," she mused, "are rarely invited for pleasure alone." The guests mingled, their conversation a tapestry of village gossip and polite inquiries. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows, and the absence of Edward Hargrove, Lady Beatrice's nephew, became a topic of murmured speculation. "Always late," Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple, her eyes bright. "I heard he's been in trouble in London, gambling, debts, the lot." Beatrice must be beside herself. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Delays," she said softly, "have a way of telling their own story." As the clock struck 7, Grayson announced dinner, and the guests moved to the dining room, its table a vision of silver and crystal, the rose centerpiece a nod to the manor's gardens. The empty chair at the table, reserved for Edward, stood out like a silent accusation. Lady Beatrice, taking her place at the head, smiled tightly. "My nephew has been delayed by the weather, I'm sure," she said, her voice bright but strained. "We shall start without him." The guests nodded, but their eyes lingered on the chair, and Miss Marple seated near the vicar. noted the subtle shift in the room's mood, a tightening of the air as the storm outside roared. The meal was exquisite, the courses served with Grayson's impeccable precision, but the conversation was stilted, the empty chair a constant reminder of absence. Sylvia Dale, her laughter bright, regaled the table with tales of the London stage, but her glances toward the door suggested she, too, was waiting. Colonel Bantry, warming to his wine, launched into a story of army life, while Mrs. Bantry whispered to Griselda about Edward's reputation. Mr. Wren, silent but watchful, sipped his claret, his eyes missing nothing. Miss Marple, her plate barely touched, listened and observed, her mind turning over the invitation and its purpose. The storm reached a crescendo, the thunder shaking the manor's walls, and the guests exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Beatrice, her necklace gleaming in the candlelight, steered the conversation to village matters, the church fete. The new schoolteacher, but her hands betrayed her, twisting her napkin with a nervousness that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Anxiety, she thought, is like a shadow. It follows closely, even when the light is bright. As the dessert course was served a delicate lemon tart, the sound of a carriage crunching on the gravel drive cut through the storm's din. Grayson excused himself, returning moments later with a figure cloaked in a dripping overcoat. Edward Hargrove, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, stood in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes shadowed. "Aunt Beatrice, I'm terribly sorry," he said, his voice unsteady. The train was delayed, and the roads were a nightmare. The guests turned, their expressions a mix of relief and curiosity, and Miss Marple, her needle still, noted the tremor in his hands, a sign of something more than travel fatigue. Lady Beatrice rose, her smile strained. "Edward, my dear, you've arrived at last. Come, dry yourself, and join us." Grayson fetched a towel and a glass of brandy, and Edward took his seat, his apologies met with polite murmurs. Sylvia Dale, seated beside him, offered a sympathetic smile, but her eyes were sharp, as if measuring the man against the rumors. Mr. Wren, across the table, said nothing, but his gaze was piercing, and Miss Marple, watching, thought of a chess game, with pieces moving silently toward an unseen checkmate. The dinner continued, the storm a constant presence, its roar a counterpoint to the guests' forced civility. Edward, now composed, spoke of London with a practiced ease, but his fingers toyed with his glass, betraying a restlessness that Miss Marple found telling. People who arrive late, she thought, often carry more than their luggage. She recalled a dinner years ago, when a late guest had brought with him a secret that changed the course of the evening, and wondered what Edward's delay might signify as the meal drew to a close. Lady Beatrice suggested retiring to the drawing room for cards, a proposal met with lukewarm enthusiasm. The guests rose, their footsteps heavy on the polished floor, and Miss Marple, lingering, noted the way Edward's eyes flicked to his aunt's necklace. A glance so brief, it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. Mr. Wren, too, seemed to watch the necklace, his expression unreadable, and Miss Marple, her knitting tucked into her bag, felt a prickle of anticipation. Jewels, she thought, have a way of attracting trouble, like moths to a flame. The drawing room was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, but the storm outside lent an air of unease. Sylvia Dale, taking the piano, played a light melody, her fingers deft but her eyes restless. Colonel Bantry, warming to the brandy, resumed his tales, while Mrs. Bantry and Griselda discussed the village fete. Mr. Clement, his prayer book in hand, spoke of charity, but his voice was strained, as if he sensed the gatherings under. Edward, standing by the window, stared into the storm, his reflection pale in the glass. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, watched the scene unfold, her mind a quiet whirl of connections. The invitation, the necklace, Edward's delight, were pieces in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. Gatherings, she thought, are like mirrors. They reflect what people wish to show, and hide what they fear to reveal. The evening ended with polite farewells, the guests dispersing to their rooms or, in Miss Marple's case, the short walk back to Rosehaven. The storm, though quieter now, lingered, a reminder that the night's calm was but a prelude to something deeper. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The invitation from Chipping Manor had set a stage, and the players, Lady Beatrice, Edward, Sylvia, Mr. Wren, the Bantrys, the Clements were, each a part of a drama yet to unfold. Mysteries, she murmured, her needles clicking, begin with the smallest things. A late arrival, a nervous glance, a necklace too beautiful to ignore. St. Mary Mead slept, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, ready to unravel the threads that the night had begun to weave. Chapter 2. The latecomer, the evening sky over St. Mary Mead had darkened to a bruised purple. The storm clouds that had threatened all day now, unleashing their fury on the village. Rain lashed the cobblestone lanes, and the wind howled through the elms, rattling the windows of Chipping Manor with a ferocity that seemed to echo the unease within its walls. Inside, the dining room glowed with the soft light of chandeliers and candles, the table a vision of elegance with its silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and a centerpiece of crimson roses. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, resplendent in a gown of deep emerald, presided over the gathering with a grace that belied the tension in her eyes. The guests, seated around the table, were a study in contrasts, their polite conversation masking a growing anticipation for the one who had yet to arrive, Miss Jane Marple, who had declined the invitation to dine but was privy to the villagers' chatter through her maid. Lily sat at Rosehaven Cottage, her knitting a steady rhythm against the storm's roar. The invitation to Chipping Manor, delivered earlier that day, had set her mind to work, and though she was not present, she could imagine the scene, the polished grandeur, the carefully chosen guests, and the empty chair that spoke louder than words. Absence, she murmured, her blue eyes fixed on the fire, is often more revealing than presence. Her thoughts lingered on Edward Hargrove, Lady Beatrice's nephew, whose delay had already become a topic of village gossip. At the manor, the guests had settled into their places, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Colonel Arthur Bantry, his moustache bristling, was recounting a tale of a monsoon in India, his voice booming over the clink of cutlery. His wife, Dolly Bantry, her hat slightly askew, listened with half an ear, her attention drawn to the empty chair at the table's end. "Really, Arthur," she whispered, "do lower your voice. We're all waiting for Edward, and your stories aren't helping." The colonel, undeterred, launched into another anecdote, his bluster a familiar comfort in the room's strained atmosphere. The vicar, Mr. Leonard Clement, sat opposite, his round face gentle but clouded with a quiet unease. His wife, Griselda, young and vibrant in a dress of pale blue, toyed with her napkin, her eyes darting to the door with every gust of wind. Sylvia Dale, the actress who had recently taken up residence in St. Mary Mead, shimmered in a gown of sapphire silk, her auburn curls catching the light as she leaned forward, her laughter bright but brittle. "Such a storm," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the cadence of the stage. "It's like something out of a Gothic play, don't you think? Poor Edward, battling the elements to join us." Her smile was dazzling, but her fingers twisted. A ring on her hand, a gesture that did not escape the notice of Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor from London, who sat across from her. His sharp eyes, like those of a hawk, dot Mr. Wren, thin and precise in a tailored suit, sipped his wine with a measured calm, his gaze moving from guest to guest as if cataloguing their secrets. His presence, though unobtrusive, carried a weight, and his silence was more telling than the Colonel's. Bluster. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, maintained her composure. Her sapphire necklace, cascade of blue stones set in silver gleaming at her throat, a focal point that drew every eye. "Edward will be here soon, I'm sure," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with a faint strain. "The trains from London are notoriously unreliable in such weather." The guests nodded, their murmurs polite, but the empty chair loomed large, a silent reminder of the latecomer's absence. Grayson, the butler, moved with impeccable precision, serving the first course of a lute, of Asparagos's face a mask of professional calm. Yet his eyes, too, flicked to the door, as if he sensed that Edward's arrival would bring more than apologies. The storm outside grew fiercer, the thunder rolling like a drum, and the windows rattled, casting eerie shadows across the room's oak-panelled walls, dot in her cottage. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the guests, whose names had reached her through Lily's eager recounting. Colonel Bantry, with his military tales, was a man of habit, his wife a font of village gossip. Mr. Clement, the vicar, was gentle but perceptive, his wife a bundle of youthful energy. Sylvia Dale, the actress, was a newcomer whose charm masked a past that the village was eager to dissect. Mr. Wren, the solicitor, was an enigma, his visits to the manor tied to legal matters that whispered of family secrets. And Edward Hargrove, the latecomer, was a figure of intrigue, his reputation for gambling and debts a constant thread in the village's chatter. People who are late, Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking, often carry burdens they cannot set down. At the manor, the conversation turned to village matters, the upcoming fete, the new curate, the state of the church, organ, but the undercurrent of anticipation was palpable. Sylvia, her laughter a bright note in the room's tension, recounted a tale of a theatrical mishap, her hands gesturing with practiced grace. And there I was, on stage, with the curtain stuck halfway. She said, her eyes sparkling, "It's moments like these that test one's nerve." Colonel Bantry, warming to the story, chuckled, but Mr. Wren's smile was thin, his gaze fixed on Sylvia as if weighing her words against some private knowledge. Mrs. Bantry, seizing a lull, leaned toward Lady Beatrice. "That necklace, Beatrice," she said, her voice low but eager. "It's simply divine. Sir Henry had exquisite taste." Lady Beatrice's hand touched the sapphires, her smile tight. "A gift for our 10th anniversary," she said, her voice soft. "It's more than a jewel, it's a memory." Her words were warm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. And Miss Marple, had she been present, would have noted the way her fingers lingered on the stones, as if anchoring herself against the storm. The meal progressed, the courses a parade of culinary finesse: roast pheasant, buttered potatoes, a salad of early greens, but the empty chair cast a shadow over the table. Grayson, refilling glasses, moved with a silence that seemed to amplify the storm's roar. The vicar, his voice gentle, spoke of the virtues of patience, but his hands twisted his napkin, a sign of unease that matched the room's mood. Griselda, catching his glance, offered a reassuring smile, but her eyes, too, were drawn to the door as the clock struck 8. The sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive cut through the storm's din. The guests paused, their forks suspended, as Grayson excused himself to answer the door. Moments later, he returned, his face impassive but his eyes alert. "Mr. Edward G. Hargrove," he announced, and a figure appeared in the doorway, drenched and disheveled, his overcoat dripping onto the polished floor. Edward, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and shadowed, offered a weary smile. "Aunt Beatrice, my apologies," he said, his voice unsteady. "The train was delayed, and the roads were a quagmire. I'm terribly sorry to keep you waiting." Lady Beatrice rose, her expression a mix of relief and reproach. "Edward, you're here at last," she said, her voice warm but edged. "Come, dry yourself and join us." Grayson fetched a towel and a glass of brandy, and Edward, shedding his coat, took the empty chair, his presence shifting the room's dynamic. The guests greeted him with polite murmurs, but their eyes were sharp, measuring the latecomer against the rumors that had preceded him. Sylvia, seated beside him, offered a dazzling smile. "You poor thing, battling that storm," she said, her voice sympathetic but her eyes curious. "You must tell us all about your journey." Edward, toweling his hair, managed a faint smile. "Not much to tell," he said, his tone guarded. "London was chaos, and the train broke down halfway. I had to take a taxi from the station." His words were casual, but his fingers trembled as he lifted his glass, a gesture that Miss Marple, in her cottage, would have found telling. "Nervousness," she might have said, "is like a crack in a vase. It shows where the pressure lies." Colonel Bantry, seizing the opportunity, launched into a tale of a storm in the Punjab, his voice drowning out the thunder. Mrs. Bantry, rolling her eyes, whispered to Griselda, "He'll go on all night if we let him." The vicar, his face softening, asked Edward about London, but the young man's responses were vague, his eyes avoiding the necklace that gleamed at Lady Beatrice's throat. Mr. Wren, silent but watchful, sipped his brandy, his gaze moving from Edward to the necklace with a quiet intensity. The dinner continued, the storm a constant presence, its roar a counterpoint to the guests' forced civility. Lady Beatrice steered the conversation to neutral ground, the village's new library, the harvest festival, but her hands betrayed her, twisting her napkin with a restlessness that matched Edward's. Sylvia, her laughter bright, recounted another theatrical anecdote, but her glances toward Edward were frequent, as if probing for a reaction. The vicar, his voice gentle, spoke of community, but his eyes lingered on the door, as if expecting another interruption. As the dessert, coarser, delicate chocolate mousse, was served, the conversation turned to the sapphire necklace, prompted by Mrs. Bantry's persistent curiosity. "It's the talk of the village, Beatrice," she said, her eyes bright. "They say it's worth a king's ransom." Lady Beatrice smiled, her hand touching the stones. "It's a family heirloom," she said, her voice soft. "Henry always said it carried our history." Her words were warm, but her eyes flicked to Edward, who looked away, his face pale. Mr. Wren, breaking his silence, spoke at last. "A fine piece," he said, his voice low. "Such jewels often carry stories beyond their sparkle." His words were polite, but his tone carried a weight that silenced the table, and Miss Marple, had she been there, would have noted the way his eyes lingered on Edward, as if seeing through a carefully constructed facade. "Stories," she might have said, "are like shadows. They follow closely, even in the brightest light. The meal drew to a close, and Lady Beatrice suggested retiring to the drawing-room for coffee and cards. The guests rose, their footsteps heavy on the polished floor, the storm's roar a constant reminder of their isolation. Edward, lingering at the table, stared at his glass, his thoughts unreadable. Sylvia, passing by, paused, her smile enigmatic. "You must be exhausted, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice low. "But you're here now, that's what matters." Edward's nod was curt, his eyes avoiding hers, and Miss Marple, in her cottage, would have found the exchange significant. People, she might have said, reveal most when they think they're hiding. In the drawing room, the fire crackled, its warmth a contrast to the chill outside. Sylvia took to the piano, her fingers coaxing a melancholy tune from the keys, while Colonel Bantry and Mr. Clement discussed the cricket season. Mrs. Bantry and Griselda, seated by the fire, whispered about Edward's arrival, their voices a soft hum of speculation. Lady Beatrice, her necklace glinting, played hostess with a practiced ease, but her eyes lingered on her nephew, who stood by the window, his reflection pale in the rain-streaked glass. Mr. Wren, seated with a coffee cup, watched the scene with his usual quiet intensity, his silence a presence as potent as the storm. Miss Marple, had she been there, would have noted the way his fingers tapped his saucer, a rhythm that suggested a mind at work. Solicitors, she might have thought, are like gardeners. They know where the roots lie, even when the surface is smooth. The evening wore on, the storm unrelenting, and the guests, though polite, were restless, their thoughts circling the latecomer and the necklace that had drawn their attention. Lady Beatrice, sensing the mood, suggested an early night, and the guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the grand hall. Edward lingered, his eyes on the fire, and Lady Beatrice, pausing at the door, looked back. "Sleep well, Edward," she said, her voice soft but edged. He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the flames. At Rosehaven, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The village's gossip, brought by Lily, had painted a picture of the evening storm. The necklace, Edward's tardiness, her mind was already weaving the threads together. "Latecomers," she murmured, "bring more than apologies. They bring the weight of what kept them." The storm raged on, and St. Mary Mead settled into a restless sleep, unaware that the arrival of Edward Hargrove had set in motion a chain of events that would soon unravel the quiet of Chipping Manor. Chapter 3. A Cry in the Night, the Storm That Battered. Chipping Manor showed no signs of relenting as the clock in the grand hall struck midnight. The wind howled like a chorus of restless spirits, and the rain lashed the windows with a ferocity that seemed to challenge the manor's ancient walls. Inside, the guests had retired to their rooms, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, leaving the house in a state of uneasy quiet. The fire in the drawing-room had burned low, its embers casting a faint glow, and the servants, save for the vigilant Grayson, had retreated to their quarters. Yet the air held a charge, as if the storm had stirred something more than the elements. In her cottage at Rosehaven, Miss Jane Marple sat by her own fire, her knitting idle in her lap. She had not attended the dinner at Chipping Manor, but the village's gossip had reached her ears through Lily, who had returned from an errand with tales of Edward Hargrove's bedraggled arrival. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the young man, whose tardiness seemed to her not merely a matter of trains and weather, but a thread in a larger tapestry. People who arrive late, she mused, her eyes on the flickering flames, often bring more than apologies. She had known such men in St. Mary Mead before, charming, restless, and shadowed by secrets at Chipping Manor. The silence was shattered by a piercing scream that cut through the storm's din. It came from the upper floor, a sound so raw and urgent that it roused the household in an instant. Doors flew open, and the guests, clad in dressing gowns and slippers, stumbled into the corridor, their faces pale in the dim light of the gas lamps. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, her silver hair loose and her face ashen, stood at the threshold of her bedroom, clutching a silk shawl. "My necklace," she cried, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "My sapphire neck gone." The guests gathered around her, their voices a jumble of concern and confusion. Colonel Bantry, his nightshirt tucked hastily into his trousers, demanded to know what had happened. "A theft, by Jove," he bellowed. "In a house like this, preposterous." Mrs. Bantry, her curlers bobbing, clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with excitement. The vicar, Mr. Clement, murmured a prayer, while Griselda, his wife, hovered at his side, her curiosity barely concealed. Sylvia Dale, wrapped in a velvet robe that seemed more theatrical than practical, gasped dramatically, her hand pressed to her chest. "Oh, how dreadful! A thief among us." Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor, stood slightly apart, his sharp eyes scanning the group. He had donned a dressing gown over his pajamas, but his composure was unshaken, as if he had been expecting some disruption. Edward Hargrove, still in the suit he had changed into after his arrival, appeared at the end of the corridor, his face flushed and his hair dishevelled. "What's happened, Aunt Beatrice?" he asked, his voice strained. "I heard the scream from my room." Lady Beatrice, regaining her poise, recounted the incident. She had retired to her room after the card game, placing her sapphire necklace, family heirloom of considerable value, on her dressing table. The piece, a cascade of deep blue stones set in silver, had been a gift from her late husband, Sir Henry, and was known to the village as a symbol of the Hargrove legacy. She had locked her door, as was her habit, and had been preparing for bed when she noticed the necklace was missing. "I checked the drawer, the jewel case, everywhere," she said, her voice rising. "And then I screamed. It's gone, I tell you." Grayson, the butler, appeared with a candelabrum, his face a mask of professional calm. "Shall I summon the servants, my lady?" he asked. Lady Beatrice nodded, and Grayson dispatched a footman to rouse the household staff. The guests, meanwhile, exchanged uneasy glances, the storm's roar a constant reminder of their isolation. The manor, cut off from the village by flooded roads, felt like a ship adrift, its passengers bound by suspicion. Colonel Bantry, ever the man of action, proposed an immediate search of the house. "We'll turn out every room, every cupboard," he declared, his moustache quivering with resolve. Mrs. Bantry, however, suggested caution. "We mustn't accuse anyone hastily, Arthur," she said, though her eyes darted toward Edward, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the group. Sylvia Dale, seizing the moment, clasped Lady Beatrice's hand. "Oh, you poor dear, to lose such a treasure, but surely it's just misplaced. Perhaps it fell behind the dressing table." Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes gleamed with a curiosity that bordered on delight, as if the theft were a scene from one of her plays. Mr. Wren, his voice low and precise, interjected, "A search is wise, but we must be methodical. A thief, if there is one, would not leave such a valuable item lying about. We should consider the timing. When was the necklace last seen?" His question hung in the air, and the guests turned to Lady Beatrice, who confirmed she had worn the necklace at dinner and placed it on the dressing table afterward. Edward, shifting uncomfortably, spoke up. "I was in my room all evening after the cards. I didn't hear anything until the scream." His words were earnest, but his hands fidgeted. And Miss Marple, had she been present, would have noted the slight tremor in his voice. "People under strain," she might have said, "often betray themselves in the smallest ways." The vicar, wringing his hands, suggested that the theft might be a misunderstanding. Perhaps a servant moved it by mistake. He offered, but Grayson shook his head. "The staff know better than to touch her ladyship's belongings," he said firmly, his loyalty to the household unwavering. As the servants assembled in the corridor, Lady Beatrice questioned each one, her tone sharp but controlled. The maids, the cook, the footman all denied any knowledge of the necklace, their faces a mix of fear and indignation. Grayson, overseeing the process, vouched for their honesty, but his eyes lingered on the guests, as if he, too, sensed that the answer lay closer to the dining room than the servants' quarters. The storm, unrelenting, cast shadows across the corridor, the lightning illuminating the faces of the gathered company. Sylvia Dale, ever the performer, suggested they check the grounds, though the idea was quickly dismissed as impractical in the deluge. Colonel Bantry, undeterred, insisted on searching the upper rooms, and the group dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the vast house. Edward volunteered to assist, his eagerness noted by Mr. Wren, who followed at a distance, his expression unreadable. In her cottage, Miss Marple was unaware of the night's drama, but she would hear of it the next morning when Mrs. Bantry, eager for an audience, called at Rosehaven. "Jane, you won't believe it," Mrs. Bantry would exclaim, her voice brimming with excitement. "A theft at Chipping Manor, and right under our noses. Beatrice is beside herself, and poor Edward looked like he'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple, pouring tea, would listen with her usual attentiveness, her mind already sifting through the details. "A stolen necklace," she would muse, "is rarely just about the necklace. It's what it represents that matters." Back at the manor, the search yielded nothing. The guests reconvened in the drawing room, where the fire had been stoked to ward off the chill. Lady Beatrice, seated in an armchair, clutched a glass of sherry, her composure fraying at the edges. "It's not just the value," she said, her voice low. "That necklace was Henry's gift to me on our 10th anniversary. It's irreplaceable." Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, swept the room, and the guests fell silent, their sympathy tinged with unease. Sylvia Dale, breaking the tension, suggested a toast to finding the necklace. "Two lost treasures and their safe return," she declared, raising her glass. The others joined in, though the gesture felt hollow. Edward, standing by the window, stared into the storm, his reflection pale in the glass. Mr. Wren, watching him, murmured something about the unpredictability of human nature, his words too soft for the others to hear. Colonel Bantry, warming to his role as the group's de facto leader, proposed a plan for the morning. "We'll search again at first light," he said. "The thief can't have gone far in this weather." Mrs. Bantry, ever practical, suggested locking the remaining valuables in the manor safe. A suggestion Lady Beatrice accepted with a nod. As the guests prepared to return to their rooms, Grayson approached Lady Beatrice with a whispered message. A single sapphire bead, glinting like a fallen star, had been found by a maid near the staircase leading to the servants' quarters. The discovery sent a ripple through the group, and Colonel Bantry seized upon it. "A clue, by Jove," The thief must have dropped it in their haste. But Mr. Wren, examining the bead, noted its pristine condition. Curious, he said, that it should be so clean, given the mud tracked through the house tonight. His observation went unnoticed by most, but Miss Marple, had she been there, would have stored it away like a precious gem. The guests dispersed once more, their footsteps heavier now, as if the weight of suspicion had settled upon them. Edward lingered in the drawing-room, his gaze fixed on the sapphire bead, now resting on a velvet cushion. "It's beautiful," he said softly, almost to himself. Sylvia, passing by, paused. "It is," she agreed, her voice low, "but beauty can be dangerous, don't you think?" Her smile was enigmatic, and Edward's answering nod was curt. In her cottage, Miss Marple slept soundly, unaware of the night's events but attuned to the rhythms of St. Mary Mead. She would learn of the scream, the theft, and the sapphire bead soon enough, and her mind would begin to weave the threads. Together, a cry in the night, she might have said, is never just a cry. It's a signal, a call to attention. And attention, in a village like this, is never wasted. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, and Chipping Manor settled into a restless silence. The sapphire necklace, or what remained of it, had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel secrets far deeper than the theft itself. The guests, bound by the manor's walls and the storm's wrath, carried their own burdens, and the night, far from over, held more surprises yet to come. Chapter 4. The Village Gossip. The morning after the storm broke over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm, as if the clouds, having spent their fury, had retreated to regroup. The village awoke to a sky washed clean, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and bruised roses. Puddles gleamed in the lanes, reflecting the pale sunlight, and the church clock, ever reliable, chimed 8 as the inhabitants began their day. At Chipping Manor, the theft of Lady Beatrice Hargrove's sapphire necklace had cast a shadow over the grandeur of the previous night's gathering, and the news, like a spark in dry grass, had spread through St. Mary Mead with astonishing speed. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table in Rosehaven Cottage, sipped her tea and listened as her maid, Lily, recounted the morning's gossip. Lily, her cheeks flushed from a brisk walk to the village shop, was a font of information, her words tumbling out like coins from a purse. "Oh, miss, you'll never believe what's happened at the manor," she exclaimed, setting down a basket of fresh rolls. "Lady Beatrice's necklace gone, stolen right from her room. They say it was worth a fortune, all sapphires and silver, and there's talk it was one of the guests what did it. The whole village is in a tizzy." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with interest, though her expression remained serene. "A theft, you say? How very distressing for Lady Beatrice. And what does the village make of it?" Her knitting, a soft cloud of pale blue wool, lay beside her, but her attention was wholly on Lily's tale. "They're saying all sorts," Miss Lily continued, warming to her subject. "Miss Hartnell, at the post office, swears it's that Edward Hargrove, Lady Beatrice's nephew. She says he's been in trouble in London, gambling and such, and he turned up late last night, all wet and nervous-like. Mr. Pye, the florist, thinks it's that Mr. Wren, the solicitor from London, says he's too quiet, and quiet ones are always up to no good. And then there's Miss Sylvia Dale, the actress Mrs. Price at the tea room says she's got a shady past. Maybe she took it for the glamour of it all." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the fragments of gossip. She knew the village's penchant for exaggeration, But she also knew that beneath the hyperbole lay kernels of truth. St. Mary Mead was a small place, its inhabitants, bound by habit and history and gossip, like the church clock, was a constant, ticking away the secrets of its people. People do love to talk, she remarked, her needles clicking softly as she picked up her knitting. But talk, Lily, is like a garden. You must know which plants to nurture and which to weed out. Lily, accustomed to her mistress's cryptic sayings, nodded and bustled off to the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The theft of the sapphire necklace was no small matter, and the involvement of Lady Beatrice's guests Colonel Bantry, the vicar, and his wife, Sylvia Dale. Mr. Wren and Edward Hargrove suggested a puzzle far more intricate than a simple robbery. Miss Marple recalled a similar incident in the village years ago, when a silver teapot had vanished from the vicarage, only to be found in the possession of a trusted parishioner with a hidden grudge. Human nature, she murmured, is so very revealing if one knows where to look. The village of St. Mary Mead, though small, was a microcosm of society, its lanes and shops a stage for the dramas of its inhabitants. The post office, presided over by the formidable Miss Hartnell, was the epicenter of news, where letters were sorted with as much scrutiny as the recipients' reputations. The tea room, run by Mrs. Price, was another hub, its tables crowded, with villagers exchanging stories over cups of tea and slices of Victoria sponge. Even the church, where Mr. Clement delivered his gentle sermons, was not immune to whispers, particularly when a scandal as juicy as a theft at Chipping Manor was. Afoot, Miss Marple, deciding to see for herself, donned her straw hat and set out for the village. The lanes were alive with activity, the storm's aftermath lending a freshness to the air. She passed the blacksmith, Mr. Tuttle, who was hammering a horseshoe and muttering about city folk bringing trouble. At the butcher's, Mr. Gibbs was slicing lamb chops and speculating that Edward Hargrove had a look about him, like he's running from something. Miss Marple smiled politely, her mind cataloguing each remark, knowing that gossip, while often distorted, held clues to the truth. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Hartnell stood behind the counter, her pince-nez glinting with authority. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp. "I suppose you've heard about the goings-on at Chipping Manor. A disgrace, if you ask me. That Edward Hargrove, turning up late, and then this happens. I always said he was no good. Ever since he was a boy, always sneaking about." Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, replied, "It's curious, isn't it, how quickly we judge. I remember a time when young Tommy Pierce was blamed for stealing apples, and it turned out to be old Mr. Giles's dog." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, and Miss Hartnell, momentarily flustered, changed the subject to the weather. From the post office, Miss Marple made her way to the tea room, where Mrs. Price was serving a group of villagers. Their voices a low hum of speculation. Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived early to secure the best table, waved Miss Marple over. "Jane, you must hear this," she exclaimed, her round face flushed with excitement. "The whole village is talking about the necklace. They found a sapphire bead near the staircase, you know, and Colonel Bantry says it's a clue, but I'm not so sure. It's all so thrilling, like something out of a novel." Miss Marple settled into a chair, accepting a cup of tea. "A bead, you say? How very interesting. And what do the guests make of it?" She listened as Mrs. Bantry recounted the previous night's events, the scream, the search, the suspicion that had settled over the manor like a fog. "Edward was awfully quiet this morning," Mrs. Bantry added. He barely touched his breakfast, and Sylvia Dale was positively theatrical, going on about the romance of a jewel theft. That Mr. Wren, though he's a cold fish, didn't say much, just watched everyone like a hawk. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the details. Sylvia Dale's theatrics, she thought, were not unlike those of a young woman she had known in her youth, whose dramatic outbursts had masked a calculating mind. Mr. Wren's silence, too, was entreating. A man who observed rather than spoke was often the one with the most to conceal. And Edward, with his late arrival and nervous demeanour, was a figure of particular interest. People under pressure, she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, often reveal more than they intend. It's the little things, the way they hold a cup, or avoid a glance, that tell the story. The tea room was crowded now, the air thick with the scent of scones and the buzz of conversation. At a nearby table, Miss Weatherby, a spinster with a penchant for embroidery and scandal, was holding court. "I saw that actress, Sylvia Dale, in the village last week," she said, her voice carrying. "She was buying a ribbon at Mr. Pye's shop, and I swear she looked shifty, probably planning the theft even then." Her companions nodded, their eyes bright with agreement. Mr. Pye, the florist who had joined the group, added his own theory. "It's that Mr. Wren I don't trust," he said, lowering his voice. "He was in my shop yesterday, asking about roses for Lady Beatrice, but he kept looking out the window, like he was expecting someone. Shifty, if you ask me." Miss Marple, overhearing, thought of a time when a stranger's interest in flowers had masked a darker purpose. "Roses," she murmured, "are so often a distraction." As the morning wore on, Miss Marple visited the church, where Mr. Clement was preparing for the Sunday service. The vicar, his face lined with worry, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you're here," he said. "This business at the manor has upset everyone. I tried to offer Lady Beatrice some comfort, but she's terribly shaken, and the guests, well, they're all on edge. I do hope it's a misunderstanding." Miss Marple, peering at the hymnals on the pew, replied, "Misunderstandings are rare, when something as valuable as a necklace is involved. But hope, Mr. Clement, is a great comfort." She noted the vicar's unease, his hands twisting the edge of his cassock, and wondered if he, too, had seen something amiss at the manor. By noon, the village was alive with theories, each more elaborate than the last. The blacksmith suggested a gang of thieves from London. The butcher hinted at a disgruntled servant, and the postman, delivering a letter to Rosehaven, confided that he'd seen Edward Hargrove arguing with a stranger near the station the previous week. Miss Marple, thanking him for the letter, filed the information away, her mind weaving connections. Arguments, she thought, are like threads. Pull one, and the whole fabric unravels. Back at Chipping Manor, the guests were gathered in the morning room, their faces drawn from a sleepless night. Lady Beatrice, dressed in a sombre grey gown, sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the garden. Colonel Bantry, pacing, insisted on another search, while Mrs. Bantry suggested calling the police. Sylvia Dale, her auburn curls pinned elegantly, proposed a reward for the necklace's return, her voice bright but her eyes watchful. Mr. Wren, seated with a newspaper, said little, but his pen scratched notes in a small leather book, unnoticed by the others. Edward Hargrove, pale and restless, stood by the fireplace, his fingers drumming on the mantel. "I wish I could help, Aunt Beatrice," he said, his voice low. "I feel dreadful about this." Lady Beatrice's gaze softened, but there was a hardness in her eyes, as if she were weighing his words against some private knowledge. Miss Marple, Returning to Rosehaven, sat by her window, her knitting resumed. The village's gossip, like a river, had brought her a wealth of information, but it was the undercurrents that interested her most. The sapphire bead, found so conveniently near the staircase, suggested a deliberate act, not a careless one. Edward's nervousness, Sylvia's theatrics, Wren's silent saw were pieces in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. Gossip, she mused, is like a mirror. It distorts, but it also reflects, and reflections, properly studied, reveal the truth. As the church clock struck 1, a new piece of news reached Miss Marple's ears. A groundskeeper, clearing debris from the storm, had found another sapphire bead near the manor's gate, where Edward's taxi had stopped the previous night. Lily, breathless with excitement, reported it to her mistress. "They're saying it's proof the thief tried to escape, Miss, but how could they, in that storm?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the discovery. "Proof," she said softly, "is a slippery thing. A bead left in plain sight is not proof of flight, but of intention." She thought of a case long ago, when a stolen brooch had been found in a garden, placed there to mislead. People, she added, are so very fond of misdirection. The village continued its chatter, each voice adding to the tapestry of suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, listened and watched, knowing that the truth, like a shy bird, would reveal itself in time. The theft at Chipping Manor was no simple crime, and the gossip of St. Mary Mead, for all its embellishments, was the key to unlocking its secrets. Chapter 5. The Unexpected Death, the second evening at Chipping. Manor descended with a stillness that belied the turmoil of the previous night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky streaked with crimson and gold, but the air within the manor remained heavy, charged with the lingering shock of the sapphire necklace's theft. The guests, their nerves frayed by suspicion and sleeplessness, gathered once more in the dining room, where the candlelight cast long shadows across the polished table. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, her elegance undiminished despite the strain in her eyes, presided with a forced composure, determined to maintain the semblance of civility. Yet the empty chair, where the necklace had once been a topic of whispered speculation, now seemed an omen of darker events to come. Colonel Bantry, his face flushed from an afternoon spent pacing the manor's grounds, was expounding on the need for vigilance. "A thief in the house is bad enough," he declared, brandishing a fork as if it were a bayonet, "but we mustn't let our guard down. Who knows what else they're planning?" His wife, Dolly Bantry, sighed, her thoughts more occupied with the quality of the soup than her husband's theories. The vicar, Mr. Clement, offered a gentle admonition about charity, his voice soft but earnest, while Griselda, his wife, stifled a yawn, her youthful energy waning under the weight of the manor's tension. Sylvia Dale, the actress, shimmered. In a gown of sapphire blooper, perhaps an unconscious echo of the stolen necklace, her laughter, bright but brittle, as she recounted a tale from the London stage. Her eyes, however, darted frequently to Edward Hargrove, who sat at the far end of the table, his face pale and his fingers toying with a wine-glass. Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor, sat opposite, his sharp features illuminated by the candlelight. He had been quieter than usual, his bird-like eyes less active, as if some inner preoccupation had dulled his usual vigilance. Lady Beatrice, noting his demeanour, leaned toward him. "Mr. Wren, you seem out of sorts. I hope the country air agrees." "With you?" Wren managed a thin smile, his voice low. Quite well, Lady Beatrice, thank you. Though I confess, recent events have given me much to ponder. His words were polite, but there was a weight to them, a hint of knowledge unspoken. Miss Marple, had she been present, would have noted the faint tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass, a sign of something more than fatigue. People who ponder, she might have said, her needles clicking softly, often know more than they let on. The meal progressed, the conversation a patchwork of forced pleasantries and veiled suspicions. Grayson, the butler, moved with his usual precision, his face a mask of professionalism, though his eyes lingered on the guests with a scrutiny that suggested he, too, sensed the undercurrents. The discovery of the second sapphire bead near the manor's gate had fueled the morning's discussions, with Colonel Bantry insisting it pointed to an outside thief, while Sylvia suggested it was a clever ruse to mislead them. Edward, when pressed, had offered little, his responses vague and his gaze distant. As the dessert course was served a delicate lemon soufflé that seemed at odds with the evening's mood, sudden commotion broke the fragile calm. Mr. Wren, who had been sipping a glass of brandy, let out a choked gasp, his hand clutching his throat. His face contorted, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. The guests froze, their eyes wide with horror, as Wren slumped forward, his breath coming in ragged heaves. "Help, please," he whispered, before collapsing onto the table, his body still. Chaos erupted. Sylvia screamed, her hands flying to her face, while Colonel Bantry leapt to his feet, shouting for Grayson. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, ordered the butler to fetch Dr. Haydock, the village physician, who lived not far from the manor. Grayson, his calm unshaken, dispatched a footman through the lingering drizzle, while Mrs. Bantry fanned herself with a napkin, murmuring about curses. The vicar, his face ashen, knelt beside Wren, muttering a prayer, while Griselda hovered, her eyes wide with shock. Edward, standing rigid by the window, stared at the scene, his hands clenched into fists. Dr. Haydock arrived within the hour, his coat damp from the journey. A wiry man with a nonsense air, he examined Wren with brisk efficiency, his brow furrowing as he sniffed the spilled brandy. "Cyanide," he declared, his voice grim. "The smell is unmistakable bitter almonds. He's gone, I'm afraid. Nothing to be done." The word cyanide hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the guests exchanged glances, their faces a gallery of fear, suspicion, and disbelief. Lady Beatrice, her hands trembling, sank into a chair. "Poison," she whispered. "In my house this is monstrous." Her eyes swept the room, as if seeking the culprit among her guests. Colonel Bantry, his bluster subdued, muttered about damned foul play, while Mrs. Bantry clutched her husband's arm, her earlier excitement replaced by dread. Sylvia, her theatrical instincts surfacing, wept softly, though her tears seemed more performative than genuine. The vicar, his prayer unfinished, looked to his wife for comfort, while Edward remained by the window, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. Grayson, ever the pillar of the household, suggested moving Wren's body to the library until the police could be summoned. The roads, though clearer, were still treacherous, and it was decided to wait until morning to contact Inspector Crane, the local officer known for his methodical approach. The guests, shaken but compliant, agreed, and Wren's body was carried to the library, where it was laid on a sofa, covered with a sheet. The brandy glass, its contents now a deadly clue, was carefully preserved, and Dr. Haydock promised to inform the coroner at first light. In her cottage at Rosehaven. Miss Jane Marple was unaware of the tragedy, her sleep undisturbed by the Manor's turmoil. Yet the news would reach her by morning, carried by Mrs. Bantry, who would arrive at Rosehaven with a breathless account of the night's events. "Jane, it's dreadful," she would exclaim, her hands fluttering. "First the necklace. Now this Mr. Wren, poisoned, right at the dinner table. I swear, it's like something out of one of your detective stories." Miss Marple, pouring tea, would listen with her usual quiet attention, her mind already turning over the implications. "Poison," she would murmur, "is such a deliberate choice. It requires planning, and planning requires motive." Back at Chipping Manor, the guests retreated to the drawing-room, their faces drawn and their voices hushed. Lady Beatrice, her composure strained, poured sherry for those who wanted it, though few accepted. Colonel Bantry, pacing by the fire, speculated about foreign agents, his military mind conjuring elaborate conspiracies. Wren was a solicitor, wasn't he? Probably mixed up with some shady types in London. Mrs. Bantry, more practical, wondered if the poison was meant for someone else, a theory that sent a chill through the room. Sylvia, seated on a velvet settee, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "It's too awful," she said, her voice trembling. "Who would do such a thing? And why Mr. Wren? He seemed so harmless." Her words were sincere, but her glance toward Edward was fleeting, as if she suspected he knew more than he let on. Edward, still by the window, spoke at last. "I saw Wren after dinner, in the library," he said, his voice low. "He was reading some papers, said it was business. I didn't stay long." His admission drew the attention of the group, and Colonel Bantry pounced. "Papers? What sort of papers? Anything to do with that necklace, perhaps?" Edward shook his head, his expression guarded. "I don't know," he didn't say. Mr. Clement, his hands clasped, suggested they pray for Wren's soul, but the idea was met with awkward silence. Griselda, ever perceptive, noted the tension in Edward's posture, the way his fingers gripped the curtain. "People react so differently to death," she said later to her husband, her voice thoughtful. "Some grieve, some speculate, and some hide." The night wore on, the Manor's grandeur overshadowed by the spectre of murder. The guests, reluctant to retire, lingered in the drawing-room, their conversation stilted. Lady Beatrice, her face pale, spoke of Wren's visit, revealing that he had come to discuss her late husband's estate. "He was reviewing some old documents," she said, her voice faltering. "I trusted him completely." Her words hung heavy, and Miss Marple, had she heard them, would have noted the implication that trust, in a house full of secrets, was a dangerous commodity. Grayson, moving silently, kept the fire stoked and the glasses filled, his presence a steadying force. Yet his eyes, too, betrayed a flicker of unease, as if he sensed the Manor's walls held more than portraits and tapestries. The sapphire bead found near the gate, and the earlier one by the staircase, were discussed in hushed tones with Sylvia, suggesting they were deliberate distractions. "A thief with a flair for drama," she said, her tone almost admiring. Colonel Bantry scoffed, but Mr. Clement, his face grave, wondered if the theft and the death were connected as the clock struck 2. The guests finally dispersed, their footsteps heavy on the grand staircase. Edward lingered in the drawing-room, staring into the fire, his thoughts unreadable. Lady Beatrice, pausing at the door, looked back at her nephew, her expression a mix of sorrow and suspicion. "Sleep well, Edward," she said, her voice soft, but edged. He nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the flames. In the library, Wren's body lay under its sheet, a silent accusation. The brandy glass, its contents, now a matter for the police, sat on a side table, its crystal catching the faint light. The manor, for all its opulence, felt like a cage, its inhabitants trapped by the weight of what had happened. The storm may have passed, but a new tempest was brewing. One of secrets and motives that would not remain hidden for long. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, slept soundly, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded. Yet her mind, even in repose, was attuned to the rhythms of St. Mary Mead, where nothing was as simple as it seemed. When the news reached her, she would sit by her window, her knitting a steady rhythm, and consider the implications of a poisoned glass and a stolen necklace. Death, she would say, her voice soft, is never an accident when poison is involved. It's a message, and messages are meant to be read. The manor settled into a fitful silence, the night stretching on, heavy with the promise of revelations yet to come. The unexpected death of Mr. Wren had shifted the puzzle, and the pieces, scattered though they were beginning to form a picture that only a mind like Miss Marple's could decipher. Chapter 6. The inspector's inquiry. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a tentative glow, as if wary of illuminating the shadows cast by the events at Chipping Manor. The village, though accustomed to its quiet rhythms, buzzed with a new intensity, the news of Mr. Percival Wren's poisoning spreading like wildfire through the lanes and shops. The theft of Lady Beatrice Hargrove's sapphire necklace, already a scandal, had been eclipsed by this graver crime, and the arrival of Inspector Crane, a stern figure from the county police, promised to stir the pot further. At Rosehaven Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the villagers' chatter. As she listened to Mrs. Bantry's breathless account of the night's tragedy, "Jane, it's simply dreadful," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her hands fluttering as she accepted a cup of tea. First the necklace, and now poor Mr. Wrenpoise, right at the dinner table. Dr. Haydock says it was cyanide, and the police are on their way. I've never seen Beatrice so shaken, and Edward, well, he looked like he hadn't slept a wink. Miss Marple's blue eyes gleamed with interest, though her expression remained serene. Poison, she murmured, her needles pausing, is such a calculated act. It's not the sort of thing one does on impulse, is it? Her mind was already turning over the possibilities, sifting through the fragments of gossip like a jeweler examining stones. At Chipping Manor, the atmosphere was one of strained civility, the grandeur of the house at odds with the grim purpose of the day. Inspector Crane, a tall man with a face like weathered granite, arrived shortly after breakfast, his notebook in hand and his manner brisk. His reputation in St. Mary Mead was one of thoroughness, if not imagination, and he set about his task with the precision of a clockmaker. The guests, summoned to the drawing-room, sat in uneasy silence, their faces a gallery of apprehension and fatigue. Lady Beatrice, dressed in a sombre black gown, maintained her composure, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she poured coffee for the inspector. Colonel Bantry, his bluster subdued by the gravity of the situation, stood by the fireplace, his mustache drooping. "A bad business, Inspector," he said, his voice gruff. "First a theft, now a murder. Never thought I'd see the day in a place like this." Mrs. Bantry, seated beside him, nodded vigorously, her curlers replaced by a sensible hat that did little to hide her excitement. The vicar, Mr. Clement, clasped his hands, his face pale, while Griselda, his wife, watched the proceedings with a curiosity that bordered on fascination. Sylvia Dale, her auburn curls pinned loosely, sat on a velvet settee, her sapphire gown exchanged for a more subdued dress, though her presence remained theatrical. "It's like a nightmare," she said, her voice trembling with just the right note of distress. Who could do such a thing to poor Mr. Wren? Her eyes, however, flicked toward Edward Hargrove, who stood by the window, his face drawn and his fingers fidgeting with a cufflink. Inspector Crane, his grey eyes sharp, began his inquiry with Lady Beatrice, who recounted the events of the previous night with remarkable clarity. "Mr. Wren was perfectly well during dinner," she said, her voice steady but strained. "He took a glass of brandy afterward, as was his habit, and then, well, you know the rest." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window where the garden lay serene under the morning sun. "I can't imagine why anyone would wish him harm. He was here to review some estate matters, nothing more." The inspector nodded, jotting notes in his book. "And the necklace, Lady Beatrice, any developments since last night?" She shook her head, her lips tightening. "Nothing, Inspector. The sapphire beads found, one by the staircase, one near the gate, are all we have. I fear the rest is lost forever." Her voice caught, and Miss Marple, had she been there, would have noted the genuine grief beneath her composure. "Loss," she might have said, "is often more than material. It's the memories that cut deepest." Crane turned his attention to the guests, interviewing each in turn with a methodical thoroughness. Colonel Bantry, eager to assert his authority, recounted his movements after dinner, insisting he had been in the billiard room with the vicar, discussing military history. "Nowhere near the brandy, Inspector," he said, his tone defensive, "and I'd no reason to harm Wren. Barely knew the man." Mrs. Bantry confirmed his account, though her eyes darted nervously, as if she feared her husband's bluster might betray more than intended. The vicar, his voice soft, admitted to being in the chapel after dinner, praying for guidance in troubled times. "I heard nothing until the scream," he said, his hands twisting. Griselda at his side added, "I was in our room, reading. It's so quiet up there, you'd never know anything was amiss." Her tone was earnest, but her eyes lingered on the inspector, as if gauging his reaction. Sylvia Dale, when questioned, leaned forward, her hands clasped dramatically. "I was in the drawing room, practicing lines for my next play," she said, her voice a blend of sincerity and performance. "I saw Mr. Wren go to the library, but I didn't follow. I was too absorbed in my work." Her smile was radiant, but Inspector Crane's expression remained impassive, his pen scratching steadily. Edward Hargrove, called last, stood stiffly, his face pale but composed. "I spoke to Wren in the library after dinner," he said, his voice low. "He was reading some papers, legal documents, I think. We talked briefly about the estate, then I left him to it. I was in my room when I heard Sylvia scream." His words were measured, but his fingers betrayed a nervous energy, twisting the cufflink until it gleamed in the light. Inspector Crane's eyes narrowed. "And these papers, Mr. Hargrove, what were they about?" Edward hesitated, his gaze flickering to Lady Beatrice. "I'm not sure," he said. "Something about my uncle's will, I suppose." Wren didn't elaborate. The inspector made a note, his silence more probing than any question. Grayson, the butler, was questioned next, his demeanor as polished as the silver he tended. "I served Mr. Wren his brandy, as I did for the other gentlemen," he said, his voice calm. "I left the decanter on the sideboard, as is customary. I saw Mr. Wren in the library later, reading a letter, but I didn't disturb him. The mention of a letter caught the inspector's attention, but a search of the library revealed no such document. Only the spilled brandy glass and Wren's body, now removed to the village morgue. Miss Marple, visiting the manor later that morning, to return a borrowed book, sat quietly in the corner of the drawing room, her knitting a soft rhythm as the inspector continued his work. She had arrived at Lady Beatrice's invitation, ostensibly to offer comfort, but her presence was a magnet for details. Mrs. Bantry, eager to share, whispered to her about the interviews, noting Edward's nervousness and Sylvia's theatrics. "That girl could be on stage right now," she said, her voice low. "And Edward, well, he's hiding something, I'd wager." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting. "Letters," she murmured, "are such curious things. They hold secrets, don't they? And when they disappear, they take their secrets with them." She recalled a case from her youth, when a missing letter had pointed to a motive as clear as day. "People," she added, "are so careless with what they write." The inspector, unaware of Miss Marple's musings, turned his attention to Wren's belongings, which had been brought to the drawing room. A small leather case contained a coded notebook, a few legal documents, and a photograph of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sylvia Dale. The discovery caused a stir, and Sylvia, when shown the photograph, flushed. "I don't know her," she said, her voice sharp. "Mr. Wren asked me some odd questions about my career, but I thought nothing of it. He was nosy." Her words were dismissive, but her hands trembled, and Miss Marple, watching, noted the flicker of fear in her eyes. The coded notebook, its pages filled with cryptic symbols, baffled the inspector, who set it aside for further study. The documents, however, were more revealing, detailing changes to Sir Henry Hargrove's estate that would affect Edward's inheritance. Wren was looking into some irregularities, Crane said, his tone guarded. It seems he had concerns about certain financial dealings. His eyes flicked to Edward, who stood rigid, his face a mask of neutrality. Lady Beatrice, overhearing, paled. "Irregularities?" she asked, her voice faint. "What sort of irregularities?" The inspector, unwilling to speculate, promised to investigate further. But the revelation hung heavy in the room, a new thread in the tapestry of suspicion. As the inquiry continued, the village buzzed with fresh gossip. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared Wren's death a judgment on his secretive ways, while Mr. Pye, the florist, whispered of a scandal involving Sylvia Dale's past. The tea room, crowded with villagers, hummed with theories, from a jealous lover to a professional assassin. Miss Marple, returning to Rosehaven, listened to Lily's latest report, her mind cataloguing each rumour. "Gossip," she said, her needles clicking, "is like a riverbed. The water may be muddy, but the stones beneath are solid." By afternoon, a new clue emerged. A maid, cleaning the library, found a faint ink stain on the carpet near where Wren's body had lain, suggesting he had been writing before his death. The inspector, informed, examined the stain, noting its similarity to the ink in Edward's room, where a pen lay on the desk. "Curious," Crane said, his voice low. "We'll have it tested, but it's a start." Edward, when questioned, claimed he hadn't written anything that night, but his unease was palpable, and Miss Marple, hearing of it later, thought of a young man in the village, years ago, whose ink-stained hands had betrayed a hidden letter. The guests, confined to the manor by the inspector's orders, grew restless, their interactions strained. Sylvia, ever the performer, took to the piano, her melodies a distraction, but her eyes watchful. Colonel Bantry, frustrated by inaction, proposed, searching the grounds again, while Mrs. Bantry fretted about the manor's reputation. The vicar, his faith shaken, spoke of divine justice, while Griselda watched Edward, her intuition sensing a deeper story. Lady Beatrice, alone in her study, stared at a portrait of her late husband, her thoughts a tangle of grief and suspicion. She had trusted Wren, but his death and the missing letter suggested secrets she had not anticipated. Miss Marple, visiting her later, offered quiet sympathy, her presence a balm. Loss, she said softly, has a way of revealing truths we'd rather not face. But truths, Lady Beatrice, have a way of surfacing. As the day drew to a close, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the inspector's inquiry casting a long shadow. The coded notebook, the ink stain, the missing letteral were pieces in a puzzle that grew more complex with each revelation. Miss Marple, back at Rosehaven, sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. Murder, she mused, is never just about the act. It's about what came before and what comes after. And in a village like this, nothing stays hidden for long. The inquiry would continue, but the truth, like the sapphire beads scattered across the manor, was waiting to be found, its facets catching the light of a keen observer's mind. Chapter 7. The Hidden Motive. The third day at Chipping Manor dawned with a deceptive serenity, the morning light filtering through the tall windows to cast a golden glow over the polished floors. The village of St. Mary Mead, though still abuzz with the news of Mr. Percival Wren's poisoning and the theft of Lady Beatrice Hargrove's sapphire necklace, had settled into a rhythm of speculation, its inhabitants weaving theories as intricate as the lace curtains in their parlours. At Rosehaven Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the villagers' chatter, as she pondered the fragments of information brought by her maid, Lily, and the ever-talkative Mrs. Bantry. The death of a solicitor and the disappearance of a jewel were no mere accidents, she knew, and the motives behind such acts were often buried deep, like roots beneath a well-tended garden. Jane, it's all so dreadful, Mrs. Bantry had said earlier that morning, her voice a mix of excitement and dismay as she settled into a chair at Rosehaven. The inspector's been poking about, asking questions, and that notebook of Mr. Wren's full of codes, they say. And then there's Edward, looking like he's carrying the weight of the world. I swear, there's something he's not telling. Miss Marple, pouring tea, had nodded thoughtfully, her blue eyes sharp. Motives, she murmured, are like shadows. They follow a person, even when they think they've outrun them. Her mind, ever active, was already sifting through the clues, the sapphire beads, the ink stain, the missing letter, each a thread in a tapestry that was beginning to take shape at Chipping Manor. The atmosphere was one of strained anticipation, the guests confined by Inspector Crane's orders as he continued his methodical investigation. The drawing room, with its heavy drapes and gleaming mahogany, had become a stage for suspicion, each guest playing their part with varying degrees of conviction. Lady Beatrice, her elegance tempered by grief, sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Colonel Bantry, his military bluster subdued, paced the room, muttering about the need for action. Mrs. Bantry, ever the observer, watched the others with a gossip's keen eye, while the vicar, Mr. Clement, offered quiet words of comfort that seemed to fall on deaf ears. Griselda, his wife, hovered at his side, her youthful curiosity undimmed by the manor's gloom. Sylvia Dale, the actress, reclined on a settee, her dress a soft grey that contrasted with her vibrant presence. She had abandoned her theatrical flourishes, but her eyes remained watchful, darting from face to face as if reading a script only she could see. Edward Hargrove, pale and restless, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the garden, where the roses drooped under the weight of the previous night's rain. Inspector Crane, his notebook ever present, moved among them, his questions sharp and his manner unyielding. The inspector's latest discovery had sent a ripple through the household. The coded notebook found among Wren's belongings had been partially deciphered by a colleague in the county police, revealing references to financial irregularities in the Hargrove estate. The documents, it seemed, pointed to discrepancies in Edward's inheritance, suggesting he had borrowed heavily against it in London. When confronted, Edward's face had flushed, his voice tight. "It's true, I've had some debts," he admitted, his eyes avoiding Lady Beatrice's. "But I've done nothing illegal. Wren was looking into it, yes, but we were sorting it out." His words were earnest, but his fingers twitched, and Miss Marple, had she been there, would have noted the strain in his posture. "Debts," she might have said, "are like chains. They bind a person to desperate acts." The photograph of the young woman, resembling Sylvia Dale, had also caused a stir. When pressed, Sylvia admitted that Wren had questioned her about her past, particularly her time in a provincial theatre troupe rumoured to have ties to unsavoury characters. "He was digging," she said, her voice sharp with indignation, "asking about things that happened years ago, things that don't matter now. I told him to mind his own business." Her defiance was convincing, but her hands betrayed a nervous energy, twisting the hem of her dress. The inspector, noting her discomfort, made a mental note to investigate further, suspecting that Wren's inquiries might have uncovered something worth killing for. Miss Marple, invited to the manor that afternoon to offer her quiet wisdom, sat in a corner of the drawing room, her knitting a steady rhythm as she observed the guests. Lady Beatrice, grateful for her presence, confided in her privately. "I trusted Mr. Wren," she said, her voice low. "He was reviewing Henry's estate, ensuring everything was in order. But now I wonder, what did he find that someone wanted to keep hidden?" Miss Marple, her eyes on her needles, replied, "Secrets, Lady Beatrice, are like seeds. They lie dormant until the right moment, and then they grow." Her words were gentle, but her mind was alert, cataloguing every glance, every gesture. The village, meanwhile, was a cauldron of speculation. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared that Wren's death was the work of a professional, hired to silence his investigations. "Mark my words," she said, her pince-nez glinting. "That solicitor knew too much, and someone wanted him out of the way." Mr. Pye, the florist, whispered of Sylvia Dale's past, hinting at a scandal that had driven her from a northern town. The tea room, crowded with villagers, buzzed with theories, from a jilted lover to a family vendetta. Mrs. Price, serving scones, opined that Edward's debts were the key, while the postman recounted a tale of seeing Edward in a heated exchange with a stranger near the station days before the gathering. Miss Marple, walking through the village earlier that day, had overheard these snippets, her straw hat tilted against the sun. She stopped at the church, where Mr. Clement was polishing the brass lectern, his face lined with worry. "I can't help but feel responsible," he said, his voice soft. "If I'd stayed with Mr. Wren after dinner, perhaps." Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, replied, "Guilt, Mr. Clement, is a heavy burden, but it's rarely deserved. We must look to the facts, not the what-ifs." Her words were kind, but her eyes were sharp, noting the vicar's unease and wondering what he might have seen back at the manor. Inspector Crane continued his interrogations, focusing on the missing letter Grayson had mentioned. A letter, he said, addressing the group, could hold the key to Mr. Wren's death. If anyone saw it or knows what it contained, now is the time to speak. The guests exchanged glances, but none spoke, their silence a wall of unspoken fears. Edward, his face pale, shook his head, while Sylvia's eyes widened briefly before she looked away. Colonel Bantry, frustrated, muttered about damned secrecy, while Mrs. Bantry suggested the letter might have been burned in the library fire. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, thought of a case from her youth when a missing letter had revealed a motive for murder. Letters, she said softly to Mrs. Bantry, who sat beside her, are like mirrors. They reflect the writer's heart, and sometimes the reader's fears. Mrs. Bantry, catching the hint, whispered, "Do you think Edward wrote it? He's been so jumpy." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes on her needles. "Jumpy, yes, but it's the quiet ones who often surprise us." The inspector's search of the manor yielded a new clue, a small vial, empty but bearing traces of a bitter-smelling substance found in a dustbin near the servants' entrance. Dr. Haydock, summoned to examine it, confirmed it likely contained cyanide, though the vial was unmarked and offered no clues to its owner. The discovery sent a chill through the guests, who gathered in the morning room to discuss its implications. Sylvia, her voice trembling, suggested it was planted to mislead, while Colonel Bantry insisted it pointed to an outsider. Edward, silent, stared at the floor, his hands clenched. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, spoke of Wren's role in the estate. "He was looking into some old transactions," she said, her voice low. "Henry's will was complex, and there were questions about certain funds." Her eyes flicked to Edward, who flinched but said nothing. The inspector, noting the exchange, pressed her further, but she deflected, claiming fatigue. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, thought of a similar case, where a family secret had driven a desperate act. Money, she mused, is so often the root of trouble. But it's the fear of losing it that drives people to extremes. As the day progressed, the villagers' gossip grew wilder. A maid at the manor, overheard at the tea room, spoke of Edward's frequent trips to London, hinting at debts too unsavoury. Lenders, another villager, claimed to have seen Sylvia Dale near the manor's gate the night of the theft, though she denied it vehemently when questioned. The inspector, methodical but frustrated, confided in Dr. Haydock that the case was a tangle of motives, each guessed a potential suspect. "It's the why," he said, "that eludes me. Why Wren? Why now?" Miss Marple, returning to Rosehaven, sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. Lily, bringing in a tray of biscuits, recounted the latest rumours, including a tale of Wren's involvement in a London scandal. "They say he was mixed up with some shady types," she said, her eyes wide. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the clues. The coded notebook, the photograph, the vial, the ink stain all pointed to a web of secrets, with Wren at its centre. "Motives," she said softly, "are like threads. Pull one, and the whole pattern shifts." The manor, meanwhile, remained a pressure cooker, the guests' interactions strained by suspicion. Sylvia, playing the piano to ease the tension, chose melancholy tunes, her fingers lingering on the keys. Edward, avoiding the others, wandered the garden, his face a mask of worry. Colonel Bantry, restless, proposed another search, while Mrs. Bantry fretted about the manor's reputation. The vicar, his faith tested, spoke of forgiveness, but his words felt hollow in the face of murder. Lady Beatrice, alone in her study, stared at a letter from her late husband, its words a reminder of happier times. She had trusted Wren, but his death suggested he had uncovered something dangerous, something tied to Edward, or perhaps Sylvia. Miss Marple, visiting her later, offered quiet sympathy, her presence a balm. Truth, she said, her voice gentle, has a way of surfacing, like a river finding its course. We need only watch the current. As evening fell, the manor settled into a tense quiet, the inspector's inquiry casting a long shadow. The hidden motive behind Wren's death was still elusive, but the clues, the notebook, the vial, the photograph were beginning to form a picture. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, knew that the truth was close, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. The second clue. Fourth morning at Chipping Manor broke with a fragile clarity, the sun casting long fingers of light across the dew-kissed lawns, as if to soften the grim realities that had taken root within the house. The village of St. Mary Mead, though accustomed to its gentle rhythms, pulsed with a restless energy. The twin scandals of a stolen sapphire necklace and Mr. Percival, Wren's poisoning fueling a fire of speculation that no amount of morning calm could extinguish. At Rosehaven Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft cadence against the hum of village gossip brought by her maid. Lily, the coded notebook, the missing letter, the vial of cyanide, and the ink stain had woven a complex web, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, sensed that the truth was drawing closer, like a shadow shrinking in the midday sun. Miss Bear saying at the tea room that the police are stumped, Lily reported, setting down a tray of tea and toast. That Inspector Crane's been asking questions all over, but nobody's talking straight. And poor Lady Beatrice's barely left her room since Mr. Wren's death. They say Edward Hargrove's been pacing the grounds like a caged animal, and that actress, Sylvia Dale, is putting on airs like it's all a play. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. People do perform, Lily, she said, her needles clicking softly. But it's the pauses between their lines that tell the story. Her mind was already sifting through the clues, each a bead in a necklace of suspicion, waiting to be strung together at Chipping Manor. The atmosphere was taut, the guests moving through the grand rooms with the wariness of players in a game whose rules they did not fully understand. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, her face pale beneath her elegant sheen, had withdrawn into a quiet dignity, her grief for the stolen necklace now overshadowed by the horror of murder. Colonel Bantry, his military bluster worn thin, sat in the morning room leafing through a newspaper with little interest. His wife, Dolly Bantry, hovered nearby, her gossip's instinct tempered by the gravity of the situation. The vicar, Mr. Clement, offered murmured prayers, his gentle demeanor a contrast to the tension that gripped the house, while Griselda, his wife, watched the others with a curiosity that belied her youth, Sylvia Dale, her auburn curls catching the morning light, paced the drawing room, her movements restless but deliberate, as if she were rehearsing a scene. "This waiting is unbearable," she declared, her voice carrying a practiced lilt. The inspector pokes and prods, but what does he expect to find? Poor Mr. Rensuch, a tragedy. Her words were sympathetic, but her eyes, sharp and searching, lingered on Edward Hargrove, who stood by the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Inspector Crane, his grey eyes as unyielding as the stone walls of the manor, continued his investigation with relentless precision. The coded notebook, now partially deciphered, had revealed Wren's concerns about financial irregularities tied to Edward's inheritance. But the missing letter Grayson had seen in Wren's hand remained elusive, a ghost that haunted the inquiry. The vial of cyanide, found in the dustbin, had yielded no fingerprints, and the ink stain in the library suggested a connection to Edward's pen, but the evidence was maddeningly inconclusive. Crane, though methodical, was beginning to feel the weight of the case, its threads tangling like a skein of wool. The morning's calm was shattered by a discovery that sent a fresh wave of tension through the manor. A maid, tidying the library where Wren's body had been found, uncovered a third sapphire bead nestled in the folds of a curtain near the fireplace. The bead, glinting like a fragment of the night sky, was identical to those found by the staircase. And the gate and its discovery drew the guests to the library, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Inspector Crane, summoned by Grayson, examined the bead with care, noting its pristine condition. "Curious," he said, his voice low. "3 beads, all found in such prominent places. It's almost as if they're meant to be seen." Lady Beatrice, standing at the library door, clutched her shawl, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Another piece of my necklace," she whispered. "But why here? Why now?" Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple, who had arrived at the manor at Lady Beatrice's request to offer counsel, noted the strain in her friend's posture. "Clues," she might have said, her needles pausing, "are like breadcrumbs. They lead somewhere, but only if you know the path." Colonel Bantry, peering over the inspector's shoulder, declared the bead a sign of the thief's carelessness. "Dropped it in their haste, no doubt," he said, his mustache twitching. "We're closing in, Crane, mark my words." Mrs. Bantry, less certain, suggested the bead might be a decoy, a theory that earned a nod from Griselda, who added, "It's like a stage prop, isn't it? Meant to catch the eye." Sylvia, her hands clasped dramatically, agreed, her voice bright with speculation. "Perhaps the thief is taunting us, leaving little gifts to keep us guessing." Edward, standing apart, said little, but his eyes lingered on the bead, his fingers tightening into fists. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed his reaction, noting the way his gaze flickered to the desk where Wren had sat. People under suspicion, she thought, often betray themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a gesture, it's all part of the pattern. Her eyes moved to Sylvia, whose theatrical sympathy seemed to mask a deeper unease, and to the vicar, whose quiet demeanor hid a nervous energy she had not noticed before. Inspector Crane, holding the bead to the light, questioned the maid, a young woman named Elsie, who blushed under his scrutiny. "I found it just now, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "It was caught in the curtain, like it had been there all along." Crane, his expression unreadable, asked if she had seen anyone in the library since Wren's death. Elsie shook her head, but her eyes darted to Edward. A fleeting glance that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. The discovery of the bead prompted a renewed search of the library, with Crane and Grayson examining every corner. It was during this search that Miss Marple, her knitting momentarily set aside, noticed a faint smudge on the edge of the desk, a trace of ink, similar to that found on the carpet. She pointed it out to the inspector, her voice mild. "Ink, Inspector, is such a persistent thing. It clings where it shouldn't, don't you think?" Crane, surprised by her keenness, nodded, making a note to compare the smudge to the pen. In Edward's room, the ink stain, though small, added a new layer to the mystery. Edward, when questioned, insisted he had not used his pen since arriving at the manor, but his voice faltered, and his eyes avoided the inspector's. Sylvia, watching from the sidelines, offered a light laugh. "Oh, Edward, you're so serious. It's just a bit of ink, surely." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were sharp, as if probing for a reaction. Colonel Bantry, impatient with the subtleties, muttered about damned clues leading nowhere, while Mrs. Bantry whispered to Griselda that Edward's nerves were positively frayed. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, thought of a case from her youth, when an ink stain had led to the discovery of a forged will. "Evidence," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "is like a stitch. One alone seems insignificant, but together they form a pattern." Mrs. Bantry, catching the hint, leaned closer. "Do you think Edward's mixed up in this, Jane? He's been so odd since he arrived." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "Oddness, Dolly, is often a mask. It's what lies beneath that matters." The village, meanwhile, was alight with fresh gossip. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared the third bead proof of a cunning thief, while Mr. Pye, the florist, whispered that Sylvia Dale had been seen near the manor's library window the night of the murder. The tea-room buzzed with theories, from a vengeful servant to a professional jewel thief, and Mrs. Price, serving tea, opined that Wren's death was tied to his nosy inquiries. "He was poking into things best left alone," she said, her voice low. "That's what gets you killed." Miss Marple, walking through the village earlier that day, had overheard these snippets, her straw hat shielding her from the sun. She stopped at the church, where Mr. Clement was arranging hymnals, his face drawn with worry. "I can't shake the feeling that I missed something," he confided, his voice soft. Mr. Wren seemed troubled that night, as if he knew something was coming. Miss Marple, adjusting her scarf, replied, "Instinct, Mr. Clement, is a powerful thing. It's often the first to see what the eyes overlook." Her words were gentle, but her mind was alert, noting the vicar's unease and wondering what he might have witnessed back at the manor. The guests gathered for lunch, their appetites diminished by the morning's discovery. Lady Beatrice, her composure strained, spoke little, her eyes lingering on Edward with a mixture of sorrow and suspicion. Sylvia, ever the performer, tried to lighten the mood with the story of a theatrical jewel theft, but her laughter rang hollow. Colonel Bantry, frustrated by the lack of progress, proposed searching the servants' quarters, a suggestion that drew a sharp glance from Grayson, who maintained his professional calm. The inspector, meanwhile, focused on the coded notebook, sending it to a specialist in London for further analysis. The photograph of the young woman resembling Sylvia Dale remained a point of contention, with Sylvia insisting it was a coincidence. "I've never met her," she said, her voice firm but her hands trembling. "Mr. Wren was fishing for scandal, that's all." Crane, unconvinced, pressed her on her past, but she deflected with a charming smile, leaving him frustrated but intrigued. Edward, avoiding the others, wandered the garden, his thoughts a tangle of fear and guilt. Miss Marple, invited to tea by Lady Beatrice, observed him from the terrace, noting the way he paused by the gate where the second bead had been found. People return to places of significance, she thought, her needles still sigh, if the ground itself calls them back. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, when a young man's pacing had led to the discovery of a hidden cache. As the afternoon faded, a new rumor reached the village. A groundskeeper had seen Edward arguing with a stranger in a London alley weeks before, a story that added fuel to the speculation about his debts. Miss Marple, hearing it from Lily, filed it away, her mind weaving. Connections, arguments, she said softly, are like sparks. They ignite something larger if you know where to look. The manor, its grandeur dimmed by suspicion, remained a crucible of secrets. The third sapphire bead, the ink smudge, the missing letter all pointed to a truth that was tantalizingly close. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, sat by the fire that evening, her thoughts on the guests at Chipping Manor. Clues, she murmured, are like stars. They seem scattered, but they form constellations if you know how to read them. The second clue had shifted the puzzle, and the motive, hidden though it was beginning to emerge from the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 9. The unravelling. The fifth day at Chipping Manor dawned with a quiet intensity. The morning light filtering through the mist that clung to the lawns of St. Mary Mead. The village, though accustomed to its gentle rhythms, thrummed with an undercurrent of anticipation, as if sensing that the twin mysteries of the stolen sapphire necklace and Mr. Percival Wren's poisoning were nearing a resolution. At Rosehaven Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting a soft rhythm against the hum of gossip brought by her maid, Lily, and the ever-eager Mrs. Bantry. The clues: 3 sapphire beads, an ink stain, a missing letter, a coded notebook, and an empty cyanide vial had formed a tapestry in her mind, each thread leading closer to the truth. Mysteries, she murmured, her blue eyes sharp, are like gardens. They require patience to see what blooms. Jane, it's positively thrilling, Mrs. Bantry had exclaimed earlier that morning, settling into a chair at Rosehaven with a cup of tea. The inspector's been at it day and night, but he's no closer to solving it, if you ask me. That third bead in the librariat's got everyone in a tizzy, and Edward Hargrove pacing like a ghost. I swear he knows something. Miss Marple, pouring tea, had nodded thoughtfully. Knowledge, she said, her needles clicking softly, is a burden when it's kept in the dark. But light has a way of finding its way in. Her mind, ever active, was weaving the clues together, sensing that the motive behind Wren's death was rooted in secrets that could no longer be contained. At Chipping Manor, the atmosphere was one of fraying nerves, the grandeur of the house overshadowed by the weight of suspicion. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, her elegance strained by days of turmoil, sat in the morning room, her hands clasped tightly, as she stared at the garden, where the roses seemed to droop in sympathy. Colonel Bantry, his military bluster reduced to restless muttering, leafed through a hunting magazine, his eyes darting to the door with every sound. Mrs. Bantry, her gossip's instinct undimmed, whispered theories to Griselda Clement, who listened with a mixture of fascination and unease. The vicar, Mr. Clement, sat quietly, his face pale, as if the burden of the manor's sins weighed on his gentle soul. Sylvia Dale, her auburn curls pinned loosely, moved through the drawing-room with a restless grace, her theatrical flair subdued but her eyes watchful. "This waiting is unbearable," she said, her voice carrying a hint of strain. "The inspector pokes and prods, but what does he hope to find? Poor Mr. Wren, he didn't deserve this." Her words were sympathetic, but her glance toward Edward Hargrove, who stood by the window, was sharp, as if she sensed a crack in his carefully composed facade. Inspector Crane, his grey eyes as unyielding as ever, continued his investigation with a dogged determination, though the complexity of the case was testing even his methodical nature. The coded notebook, now partially deciphered, had revealed Wren's suspicions about financial irregularities tied to Edward's inheritance, hinting at debts to a shadowy London financier. The photograph of the young woman resembling Sylvia Dale suggested a past she was eager to keep hidden, while the missing letter Grayson had seen in Wren's hand remained a tantalizing void. The cyanide vial and the ink stain in the library pointed to a deliberate act, but the motive, elusive and multifaceted, remained just out of reach. Miss Marple, invited to the manor that afternoon to offer her quiet counsel, sat in a corner of the drawing room, her knitting a steady rhythm as she observed the guests. Lady Beatrice, grateful for her presence, confided in her privately. "I can't help but feel responsible," she said, her voice low. "Mr. Wren was here at my invitation, looking into matters I should have addressed years ago. If I'd been more vigilant." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple, her eyes on her needles, replied, "Regret, Lady Beatrice, is a heavy burden, but it clouds the truth. We must look to what is, not what might have been." Her words were gentle, but her mind was alert, cataloguing every nuance of the scene. The discovery of the third sapphire bead in the library had shifted the investigation, prompting Inspector Crane to re-examine the room with renewed scrutiny. It was during this search that a new clue emerged, a small scrap of paper tucked beneath a book on the library shelf, bearing a single word in Wren's precise handwriting. "Trust." The word, cryptic yet suggestive, sent a ripple through the guests when Crane revealed it. "Trust," he mused, holding the scrap to the light. What did Wren mean by it? A person, a concept, or something else entirely? His question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy with implication. Colonel Bantry, seizing on the word, declared it proof of a betrayal. "Wren must have trusted the wrong person," he said, his mustache twitching. "Someone close, mark my words." Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for drama, suggested the paper was part of the missing letter, perhaps torn in a struggle. Sylvia, her hands clasped, offered a theatrical sigh. "It's so poetic, isn't it? Trust, betrayed in a house like this. It's like a play." Her words were light, but her eyes darted to Edward, who stood rigid, his face pale. Edward, when questioned about the paper, shook his head. "I don't know what it means," he said, his voice tight. "Wren and I spoke briefly about the estate, but he never mentioned trust." His fingers fidgeted with his cufflink, and Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the gesture. Nervousness, she thought, is like a stitch dropped in knitting. It shows where the pattern is weak. She recalled a case from her youth, when a single word scribbled on a scrap had unlocked a motive for murder. The village, meanwhile, was a cauldron of fresh speculation. At the post office, Miss Hart opined that the word trust pointed to a family secret, perhaps tied to Edward's debts. "He's been borrowing from heaven knows who," she said, her pince-nez glinting, "and that solicitor found out." Mr. Pye, the florist, whispered of Sylvia Dale's past, suggesting she had once been entangled in a fraud case involving a theatrical troupe. The tea room buzzed with theories, from a vengeful servant to a conspiracy orchestrated from London. Mrs. Price, serving scones, declared that Wren's death was a warning, meant to silence his inquiries. Miss Marple, walking through the village that morning, had overheard these snippets, her straw hat shielding her from the sun's glare. She stopped at the church, where Mr. Clement was tending to the flower beds, his face drawn. "I keep thinking of Mr. Wren," he confided, his voice soft. "He seemed so burdened that night, as if he carried a secret he couldn't share." Miss Marple, adjusting her scarf, replied, "Secrets Mr. Clement, are like shadows. They grow longer as the day wears on, but they always lead back to their source. Her words were kind, but her mind was sharp, noting the vicar's unease and wondering what he might have overheard. Back at the manor, Inspector Crane gathered the guests in the library, determined to press them on the new clue. "This word, trust," he said, holding up the scrap of paper, "suggests Mr. Wren knew something perhaps about one of you. If anyone has information, now is the time to speak." His gaze swept the room, lingering on Edward, whose face flushed, and Sylvia, whose smile was a shade too bright. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the library clock. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, spoke at last. "Mr. Wren was reviewing my husband's estate," she said, her voice low. "There were questions about certain funds transactions that Edward was involved in. I didn't think it serious. But perhaps—" Her eyes met Edward's, and he looked away, his jaw tight. Crane, noting the exchange, pressed Edward further. "What did Wren know about these transactions, Mr. Hargrove?" he asked, his tone sharp. Edward's response was curt. "Nothing that warranted murder. They were debts, not crimes." Sylvia, seizing the moment, leaned forward. "Inspector, you can't possibly think Edward would do such a thing. He's been nothing but kind." Her defense was fervent, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, and Miss Marple, observing, thought of a young actress she had known, whose loyalty had masked a deeper agenda. Loyalty, she mused, is so often a performance. The inspector, undeterred, turned his attention to the ink stain on the desk, which had been confirmed to match the pen in Edward's room. "This ink," he said, "suggests someone was writing in the library before Wren's death. Perhaps the missing letter." Edward, his face pale, insisted he had not written anything that night, but his voice faltered, and Crane's eyes narrowed. Sensing a crack in his story, Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, spoke up, her voice mild but piercing. "Ink, Inspector, is such a telltale thing. It lingers, like a memory, and points to where someone has been." Her words, though gentle, carried weight, and Crane, surprised by her insight, made a note to re-examine Edward's belongings. Miss Marple, watching the guests, noted Sylvia's quick glance at Edward, as if gauging his reaction, and the vicar's nervous fidgeting, as if he, too, held a piece of the puzzle. As the day wore on, a new piece of gossip reached the village. A groundskeeper had found a scrap of fabric near the gate, caught on a thorn, that matched the grey dress Sylvia had worn the night of the theft. When confronted, Sylvia laughed it off, claiming she had taken a walk in the garden despite the storm. "I needed air," she said, her smile dazzling. "Is that a crime?" Crane, unconvinced, added the fabric to his growing list of clues, suspecting it tied to the bead found at the gate. Miss Marple, returning to Rosehaven, sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as Lily recounted the latest rumours. "They're saying Miss Dale's not what she seems," Lily said, her eyes wide, "and that Edward's debts are to some dangerous types in London." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. The sapphire beads, she thought, were not accidents but markers, placed to mislead or to accuse. The ink stain, the scrap of paper, the fabrico pointed to a deliberate act, a motive rooted in fear or greed. "People," she said softly, "are so eager to hide their truths. But truths, like weeds, always break through." At the manor, the guests gathered for dinner, their interactions strained by the day's revelations. Lady Beatrice, her face pale, spoke little, her eyes lingering on Edward with a mixture of sorrow and suspicion. Sylvia, her laughter forced, tried to lighten the mood with a story of a theatrical mystery, but her words fell flat. Colonel Bantry, restless, proposed a toast to justice, while Mrs. Bantry whispered to Griselda about Edward's debts. The vicar, his faith tested, spoke of redemption, but his voice trembled, as if he sensed the storm within the manor was far from over. Inspector Crane, dining with the guests, watched them closely, his notebook at hand. He had sent the coded notebook to London for further analysis, hoping it would reveal more about Wren's suspicions. The photograph, the vial, the beads, all were pieces in a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Miss Marple, invited to stay for dinner, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her knitting a soft rhythm in her lap. Mysteries, she thought, unravel like a skein of wool. Pull the right thread, and the whole pattern falls into place. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple took Lady Beatrice aside, her voice gentle but firm. "The truth, my dear, is close," she said, "but it requires courage to face it. Trust your instincts, and the answers will come." Lady Beatrice nodded, her eyes glistening, and Miss Marple, returning to her knitting, knew that the unravelling was at hand. The motive behind Wren's death and the theft waiting to be laid bare in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 10. The Quiet Resolution. The 6th day at Chipping Manor dawned with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air of St. Mary Mead sensed the weight of truths waiting to be unveiled. The village, its lanes, bathed in the soft light of a July morning, hummed with a subdued anticipation. The gossip of the past days, tempered by a feeling that the mysteries of the stolen sapphire necklace and Mr. Percival, Wren's poisoning, were nearing their end. At Rosehaven Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting a gentle rhythm against the murmur of the village, as she pieced together the clues that had emerged over the week. 3 sapphire beads, an ink stain, a missing letter, a coded notebook, a cyanide vial, a scrap of paper with the word trust, and a fragment of grey fabric. Each was a thread in a tapestry that, to her discerning eye, was now almost complete. "Truth," she murmured, her blue eyes sharp, "is like a flower. It blooms quietly, but only after careful tending." At Chipping Manor, the atmosphere was one of fragile tension, the grandeur of the house a stark contrast to the unease that gripped its inhabitants. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, her elegance worn thin by days of strain, sat in the drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly as she gazed at the portrait of her late husband, Sir Henry, whose legacy seemed to haunt the present. Colonel Bantry, his military bluster reduced to restless pacing, muttered about the need for answers, while Mrs. Bantry, her gossip's instinct undimmed, whispered theories to Griselda Clement, who listened with a quiet intensity. The vicar, Mr. Clement, sat with his prayer book, his face drawn, as if seeking solace in words that felt inadequate. Sylvia Dale, her auburn curls subdued by a simple chignon, moved through the room with a restless grace, her theatrical flair tempered but her eyes watchful. Edward Hargrove, pale and withdrawn, stood by the window, his hands fidgeting with a pocket watch that gleamed in the morning light. Inspector Crane, his grey eyes as unyielding as the manor's stone walls, had spent the morning reviewing the evidence, his notebook filled with meticulous notes. The coded notebook, now fully deciphered by the London specialist, had revealed Wren's investigation into Edward's financial dealings, confirming debts to a notorious London financier named Victor Cranell, relation to the inspector, but a figure known for ruthless tactics. The photograph of the young woman, resembling Sylvia Dale, hinted at a past scandal, while the missing letter, the cyanide vial, the ink stain, the sapphire beads, and the scrap of fabric wove a complex web of motive and opportunity. Crane, though methodical, was frustrated by the case's intricacies. Sensing that the truth was tantalizingly close but elusive, Miss Marple, invited to the manor that morning at Lady Beatrice's request, sat quietly in a corner of the drawing room, her knitting a soft rhythm as she observed the guests. Mrs. Bantry, eager for her friend's insight, whispered, "Jane, you must have some idea. That bead in the library, the ink stain, it's all pointing somewhere, isn't it?" Miss Marple, her eyes on her needles, replied, "Clues, Dolly, are like stitches. They seem scattered, but they hold the pattern together. We need only find the right thread to pull." Her voice was gentle, but her mind was sharp, weaving the clues into a coherent narrative that was beginning to take shape. The morning's quiet was broken by a summons from Inspector Crane, who gathered the guests. In the library, where Wren's body had been found, "We're close to answers," he said, his voice firm but weary. "The evidence, the beads, the ink, the notebook, the vial points to a deliberate act, one driven by a motive we've yet to fully uncover. I ask you all to be honest now, before the truth is forced out." His gaze swept the room, lingering on Edward, whose face paled, and Sylvia, whose smile was a shade too bright. Lady Beatrice, her voice low, spoke first. "Mr. Wren was here to protect the estate," she said, her eyes glistening. "He found irregularities, transactions involving Edward's inheritance. I trusted him to set things right." Her words hung heavy, and Edward flinched, his fingers tightening on the watch. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice strained. "Yes, I had debts, but I was working to settle them. Wren was helping me, not accusing me." Sylvia, seizing the moment, leaned forward. "Inspector, you can't think Edward would do such a thing. He's been nothing but kind." Her defense was fervent, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, and Miss Marple, watching, noted the subtle shift in her posture. Loyalty, she thought, is so often a mask for self-preservation. The vicar, his hands clasped, spoke of Wren's troubled demeanor the night of his death. "He seemed burdened," Mr. Clement said, his voice soft, as if he knew something dangerous. "I wish I'd pressed him." Griselda at his side added, "He was writing in the library. I saw him. He looked afraid." Her words, though quiet, sent a ripple through the group, and Crane made a note, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, spoke up, her voice mild but piercing. "Fear, Inspector, is a powerful motivator. It drives people to act in ways they wouldn't otherwise." Her words drew the group's attention, and Crane, surprised by her insight, invited her to elaborate. "The sapphire beads," she said, her eyes on her needles, "are curious, aren't they? Found in such obvious places, the staircase, the gate, the library, almost as if they were meant to be found to point us in a particular direction. And the ink stain, matching the pen in Mr. Hargrove's room, it suggests a connection, but perhaps not the one we assume." Crane, intrigued, asked, "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her expression serene. "Only that things are not always what they seem. The beads, the ink, the letter, they're pieces of a puzzle, but the picture they form depends on how we arrange them." Her words, though cryptic, carried weight, and the guests exchanged uneasy glances. Sensing that the net was tightening, the village, meanwhile, was alive with fresh gossip. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared the third bead proof of a cunning plan, while Mr. Pye whispered that Sylvia's past held the key to Wren's death. The tea room buzzed with theories, from a family vendetta to a professional hit, and Mrs. Price, serving tea, opined that Edward's debts were a motive too obvious to ignore. Miss Marple, walking through the village earlier that day, had overheard these snippets, her straw hat shielding her from the sun's glare. She stopped. At the church, where Mr. Clement was polishing the brass lectern, his face drawn. "I keep thinking of that word, trust," he confided. "It haunts me, Miss Marple." She nodded, her voice gentle. "Trust, Mr. Clement, is a fragile thing. It's often betrayed by those closest to us." Back at the manor, Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Crane, who welcomed her insight with a mix of curiosity and respect. In the quiet of the study, she laid out her theory, her voice calm but precise. The sapphire beads, she said, were not dropped by accident. They were placed by the staircase, the gate, the library to cast suspicion, to create a trail that leads nowhere. The ink stain, matching Edward's pen, suggests he was in the library, but not necessarily to kill. The missing letter, the word trust, the coded notebook, they point to a motive rooted in fear, not greed. Crane, his notebook open, listened intently. "Go on," he said, his tone encouraging. Miss Marple continued, her eyes on her knitting, which she had brought with her. "Mr. Wren was investigating Edward's debts, yes, but he was also looking into Sylvia Dale's past. The photograph suggests a connection, a scandal, perhaps, that she wished to keep hidden. The cyanide vial, found in the dustbin, was too convenient to clean. And the fabric, matching Sylvia's dress, places her near the gate where the second bead was found. I believe, Inspector, that we're looking at a carefully orchestrated plan. One designed to protect a secret by sacrificing another." Crane's eyes widened, but he pressed her further. "And the murderer?" Miss Marple, her needles clicking, replied, "Consider Edward. His debts made him vulnerable, but his late arrival was deliberate, a way to distance himself from the theft. The necklace was taken to cover his debts, but Wren's discovery of the truth, perhaps detailed in that missing letter, threatened to expose him. The word trust was a warning, not to Edward, but to Sylvia, who Wren suspected of complicity in a past fraud. Edward, desperate, poisoned Wren's brandy, using the cyanide he had procured in London, and planted the beads to mislead us. The inspector, impressed, asked, "And Sylvia?" Miss Marple smiled. She knew more than she let on. Her defense of Edward was a performance, meant to deflect suspicion. But her presence at the gate, her past, they tie her to the motive, if not the act. Crane, nodding, made a note to confront Edward with this theory, sensing that the truth was within reach. That evening, the guests gathered in the drawing room, their faces tense as Crane prepared to make his case. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, watched as the inspector laid out the evidence: the notebook, the beads, the ink, the vial, the fabric, the word trust. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice firm, "you had motive and opportunity. The ink stain places you in the library. The notebook confirms Wren's suspicions about your debts, and the beads were a clumsy attempt to mislead us. Did you poison Mr. Wren to silence him?" Edward, his face ashen, stood rigid, his hands trembling. The room fell silent, the ticking of the clock a deafening pulse. Lady Beatrice, her eyes glistening, whispered, "Edward, tell me it isn't true." Sylvia, her hands clasped, looked away, her face pale. Colonel Bantry, his bluster gone, stared in disbelief, while Mrs. Bantry clutched Griselda's arm. The vicar, his prayer book forgotten, murmured a plea for truth. Edward's resolve broke, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice cracking. "Wren found out about my debts to Victor Crane, who threatened to ruin me. I took the necklace to pay him off, but Wren knew. He wrote a letter to Aunt Beatrice, detailing everything. I panicked. The cyanide was meant to scare him, to make him back off. I didn't think he'd drink so quickly." His confession, raw and halting, filled the room, and Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sylvia, her composure cracking, spoke up. "I knew about the debts," she admitted, her voice low. "Wren asked me about Victor Crane. He thought I was involved because of my past. I told Edward to be careful, but I didn't know he'd go this far." Her words, though soft, carried a weight of guilt, and Miss Marple, watching, nodded. Truth, she thought, comes in layers, like petals unfolding. Crane, his notebook closed, signaled to a constable who had arrived with him. "Edward Hargrove, you're under arrest for the murder of Percival Wren and the theft of the necklace." As Edward was led away, his head bowed, Lady Beatrice wept softly, her grief tempered by a resolve to face the truth. The necklace Crane revealed had been found hidden in Edward's suitcase, wrapped in a handkerchief, its sapphires glinting like accusations. The guests, shaken, dispersed, their voices hushed. Sylvia, her eyes glistening, retreated to her room, her past a shadow she could not escape. Colonel Bantry, his faith in order shaken, muttered about justice, while Mrs. Bantry, for once subdued, clung to Griselda's arm. The vicar, his face grave, offered a prayer for healing. His words a balm to the wounded household. Miss Marple, her knitting complete, rose to leave, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. Lady Beatrice, taking her hand, whispered, "Thank you, Jane. You've saved us from ourselves." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle. "People, my dear, are their own worst enemies, but truth, like a river, always finds its way." She departed, her straw hat tilted against the evening sun, leaving the manor to its healing. Back at Rosehaven, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a new skein of wool, its pattern yet to be formed. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its quiet rhythms, the gossip fading like the mist. The mystery of Chipping Manor, with its beads and secrets, had been unravelled, its truths laid bare by a spinster's keen eye. "Human nature," she murmured, her needles clicking, "is so very predictable, yet so very surprising." The end.